Welcome everyone to my Biml for Beginners Script and Automate SSIS development session. My name is Cathrine Wilhelmsen, or Cathrine Wilhelmsen. I work as a senior BI consultant in a Norwegian company called Inmeta. I do a lot of things. I think the most important thing on this slide is my website. After the session, you will be able to download my slides and demos from there. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me. I'm most active on Twitter at Cathrine W. Just please note that there's no E in the middle of my name. That's the funny Scandinavian spelling. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and a BimlHero, and I've been fortunate enough to co-author a couple of really cool books. That's it for me, though. The most important thing here today is all about you guys and how you can improve your workday. So over the next 60 minutes, I'm going to cover three main topics. The first is the Biml basics. What is Biml and BimlScript? What does the syntax look like? And how does it work with and compare to SSIS? Second one is we're going to look at a couple of different tools that you can use to work on your Biml projects. And finally, we're going to tie it all together and look at how you can automate SQL scripts and SSIS packages from your source metadata. Now, this is a Biml for a beginner session, but it's not an introduction to SSIS. So if you're brand new to SSIS, I can point you to multiple resources on that afterwards. But for this topic here today, it's all about Biml. As mentioned, the session will be recorded and you can download the slides and demos after the session is over. I do know that sometimes I get very excited about this topic and I talk a little bit fast, so you can always go back and check something. Before we get started on the actual content, though, I want to share a little story with you that might sound familiar to some of you who have been working on SSIS. So meet Sandra. Sandra works as an SSIS developer. Sandra has been tasked with a new staging project in her data warehouse where she has to work on over 100 similar SSIS packages. Sandra's awesome at her job, but she hates repetitive work and she gets quite bored of creating those same packages over and over and over again. But she keeps working and working until she's done and she's finally completed her project. She's happy, she's ready for her next task. And then her manager walks in and tells Sandra that, you know, you've done a really great job, but we just have a few new requirements for you. And Sandra gets to go back and update every single one of those SSIS packages one more time. Yay. If this sounds familiar to you, I know for sure it sounds familiar to me, then you might be ready for a change. And that change is Biml. Biml stands for Business Intelligence Markup Language. It's an easy-to-read and write XML language that describes your business intelligence objects. It can describe things like your relational database, schemas, tables, views, and columns, your SSIS packages, and if after the session you realize that this is really cool and you want to invest a little bit more money than the free tools, you can also do things like develop SSIS cubes and even Azure Data Factories, but you do have to pay for those features. So that's not something that I will cover in the session. So hang on, did you just say that Biml is XML? Yes, I did, and I know XML is probably not the most amazing language out there. But the reason you want to use Biml instead of SSIS is because of how the tools work and the things you can get out of it. Now with SSIS, you often spend a lot of time on what I call the plumbing. Things that don't provide any value whatsoever. It's just things you need to do to get your projects to work. Things like dragging, dropping, aligning, switching between windows and tabs, and anything that doesn't actually work on the business logic. Now with Biml, our end goal is to get to the point where you have your entire framework and you have your Biml patterns so you can just auto-generate those SSIS packages when needed. So that can allow you to spend more time on actually focusing on the business logic, what's unique in a package. So will this solve all of your challenges? And the quick answer to that is no, it won't. Biml is a tool. It is an amazing tool for generating SSIS packages and even things like SQL scripts, but it's not a predefined data warehouse framework or ETL framework, and it's not a tool for automating the actual deployment processes. Biml can be part of an automated deployment continuous integration, but it's not something that it provides out of the box. So you do need to be aware of what Biml can do for you and then assess whether or not that is the right tool to use, just like any other tool out there. Now what Biml can do for you, however, is it can be extremely time-saving. If you have many SSIS packages that follows a standard pattern, for example, staging, which is what I'm going to focus on in this session here today, or even other things that are common in traditionally data warehouse projects, things like your slowly changing dimension patterns or your fact load patterns, those are things that you can easily standardize and create one pattern, one Biml file, and spin up all your SSIS packages based off of that. It's also very reusable. Once you have your BimlScript, you can run it on any platform. So it supports from SQL Server 2005 all the way up to 2017. And this actually allows you, this is a very rare use case, but if you do need to downgrade your projects, if you've done it through Biml, it's very easy. You just regenerate your packages on that platform. Or the other way around, which is a more common use case, where you upgrade your packages. And Biml is also very flexible. You can start very simple on very specific use cases, and that's what I recommend. Start as simple as possible to solve something that can save you a lot of time, and then expand as you learn. You don't have to dive into the deep end and build your entire framework from scratch from day one. You can do that over time. So how does SSIS development work? Now, when you're working with SSIS traditionally, you have a developer who builds some kind of SSIS package. That's a very manual process. You have to build that package, and then for the next package, same process. You have to manually create that package, and so on, and so on, and so on. With Biml, it works similarly, but a little different. So you still have a developer, but instead of generating the actual SSIS package, that developer creates a Biml file. And based off of that Biml file, you can generate all your packages. So hopefully you can see how time-saving this can be for those use cases where you have many SSIS packages. And what do you need? Well, it's very simple. You need one add-in for Visual Studio called Biml Express. This is completely free. You can download it from verogens.com/BimlExpress. It's an add-on that allows you to work on your Biml projects, and I will show you this in just a couple of minutes. Once you have your add-on installed, you just add in your Biml files to your SSIS projects, and you're good to go. And the way Biml works is, like mentioned previously, this is an XML language, so there is a fair amount of code, but Biml has been made to be easy to read and write. So hopefully when you're looking at the screen right now, you can all guess what this little code snippet here does. And if you're thinking that this is completely useless, you're absolutely right. This does not do anything useful whatsoever. It generates 2 empty SSIS packages, but it does show you what the syntax looks like. So starting with the root element, we start with our Biml, and then we define our XML namespace. You don't have to remember this URL. It's long. You don't have to even worry about it. This is auto-generated for you when you create a new Biml file. So inside your root element, you have your collections of elements. In this case, it's packages, but it could also be things like your databases, your tables, or your schemas. All of those large business intelligence objects that you work with. Inside your collections, you have the individual elements. In this case, we have 2 separate SSIS packages. Again, this could be tables or schemas, anything that you want to generate through your BimlScript. These elements have some attributes. There are some attributes that are required. Name is one of them. And you can imagine when you're working in SSIS and you're dragging a component onto the interface, it gives you a default name for you. For example, Dataflow 1 and 2 and so on. In Biml, you don't have that, so you do need to specify the name so you can refer back to that package or table or whatever later. Other attributes are, most of them are not required. Biml is based off of defaults, so unless you want to override the defaults, you probably don't have to specify the attributes, although in some cases there are some required attributes. But it is made to be as simple and easy as possible. And then just to show you very quickly here how you can do the full versus the shorthand syntax. On that first line where you see where we end with /package, that's the full syntax. That is what you want to use if you have child elements inside of there. And usually inside a package, you want some tasks, so that is what we would use. But in case you don't have any child elements, you can save yourself a couple of keyboard strokes by just ending it with that slash at the end instead. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like. I am going to switch over to my Visual Studio environment. And what you can see on the screen here now is I have my SSIS project open on the right side. And what you might notice is that I don't have any SSIS packages in my project, but I do have a whole bunch of Biml demo files in here that I'm going to go through. So the way you add these Biml files, you can do it in a couple of different ways. The first one is to right-click on the SSIS project and say Add New Biml File. The other option is to go from this new fancy little Biml Express toolbar you get up on the menu here and say Add New Biml File. And you'll see we have a couple of different options. We can add code files. That's not something I will cover here today. And a couple of different options that you will find in any add-on. So once you've created your Biml file and you open it up, you'll see something like this. This is the core of a Biml package. And what you can do in here is, what I recommend is when you start learning Biml is that you really get into using the IntelliSense and see how it can help you. So if I start typing here and I start with an angle bracket here, you can see that I get this little IntelliSense telling me everything that I can do inside my package. So things we are familiar with, analysis services processing, or if I scroll down here, CDC control, container, data flow, and so on. All the things that you would recognize from the SSIS control flow. And once you have your package, again, this is pretty useless since we're not really doing anything, but just to show you how this works, is that you right-click on a package and you say Generate SSIS Packages. When I do that, you'll see this little toolbar down here that says Generating SSIS Packages. You can see the progress bar as well. And once that has been able to think, we now have our empty package in our SSIS project. Simple as that. So the other thing that I want to show you is that you don't have to create one SSIS package per Biml file. You can create as many as you want inside one Biml file. In this case here, we create 5 empty packages and then an almost empty package. Again, if we scroll down, we can see that we now have a data flow in here. And again, if I look at the IntelliSense, I can now see that I have all of these other different options. So aggregate or audit and things like that that we would find inside a data flow. So this really helps you get started using Biml. And again, if I save this and right-click and say Generate SSIS Packages, it's going to create all of those packages that we specified, and it's going to add that to our project. So we can see now that we have our empty package from the first file, our 5 other empty packages from the second file, plus an almost empty package. So it's completely up to you how you want to create your Biml files and what kind of SSIS packages that you need to create. And again, this might not be the most useful option, but hopefully one thing that you notice is when you're working with all of this code here, you don't have to worry about your SSIS packages anymore. You can just delete them and regenerate them when necessary. This also has one additional benefit, and that is that all your Biml code, since it's just text, you can use any kind of source control to check in, to quickly see the differences, and if I add something in here, if I add a new task in my data flow, it's easy to see in source control that I have added or removed or changed something. If you do that with SSIS packages, you might see that you get new versions if you just move things around on the interface. So that's an additional bonus by using SSIS. But let's take a look at something that's a little more interesting than all of these empty packages. So I'm going to close out my files, and what I'm going to do here first is I'm going to create the SSIS package and show you what the end result looks like, and then I'm going to compare that with the Biml code. Here we go. So if I open up this package And this is going to be the basis for all of my demos here today. This is a very simple truncate and load pattern, typically for staging and data warehouse projects. What we do is we want to truncate our destination table. Let's see if we open up. We want to truncate our destination table, and then we want to reload the data from our source. And finally, we want to log those rows into some kind of admin or audit database. So if I look at the Biml for this, I'm going to open up this and move this to a new group and just hide this out. Hopefully that makes it a little easier for you to reference what we're actually doing. Here we go. So looking at our code, we can now see that we're doing a little bit more inside our BimlScript. The first thing we do is to define our connections. So we have 3 OLEDB connections named admin, WWI, and staging. And we can see that these are the same connections that we would find down in our connection manager inside the SSIS package. Going down into our packages, we now start defining our actual package, in this case load warehouse colors, and it has this little funny thing called constraint mode. In this case it's set to linear. What this means is that everything inside your control flow is automatically created those precedence constraints for you. So based on the order of your code, it's going to auto generate these connections for you, or constraints. So that makes it a little easier because you don't have to even specify how to connect these things if you use the linear. Now, if you have patterns that are a little more complex, for example, if you do need to kind of split and merge or join something in here, then you could use what is called parallel, as you can see here. That will just create all the tasks side by side, and then you need to wrap it up the way that you need to. But for simplicity, stick to linear as long as your control flow is simple like this. Then we define a variable called new rows, which is the row count that we want to log at the end of the package. And then we go in and specify our actual tasks. So the first one we see here is the execute SQL task named truncate warehouse colors, where we just do a simple truncate table. You can see that one over here. Then we go into our data flow, and this is one of the first places where you'll notice that Biml is a little bit different than SSIS, because I can now immediately see everything that goes on in my data flow, whereas in SSIS, I have to actually go in and switch that context over to the data flow. Just takes a couple of seconds, but still it's kind of precious time I'm wasting on doing that. But once I'm inside my data flow, we can see exactly what we see in the Biml. We have our OLEDB source, we have a derived column, we have a row count, and then finally our OLEDB destination. Same thing in here, it all adds up just the way that we specified it in our code. And then finally, we go back out into our control flow, and we do our log rows execute SQL task at the end. And again, this is probably one of the tasks that is very time-saving for me at least, because when you need to do this in SSIS, so what I would have to do here is I have to drag this onto the interface, I have to connect this arrow, then I have to go in, we get to use this nice little interface here where we enter the SQL query, and then we have to select a drop-down from this connection here, we have to go probably into parameter mapping, and because of the user interface is so lovely, I have to spend time on opening up all of these columns just to get to the point where I can start changing things, right? Again, it's not a whole lot of time, but imagine doing that 100 separate times if, for example, your logging requirements change and you have to create a new parameter in every single one of your 100 SSIS packages. It's very time consuming. In Biml, all you have to do is copy and paste this one line of code, change the variables, and then regenerate all of your packages. So hopefully that can show you how easy this is to use compared to all of that manual work in SSIS. So that's the very basics of Biml, and hopefully even if you're not very familiar with SSIS, or if you have no programming or coding experience whatsoever, you can still kind of read all of these little things going on here and see how they map up with the SSIS package. So that was the basics of Biml, and for those of you watching this, I'm going to save all of the questions until the end of the session, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and I'll answer everything at the end of the session. So that was the basic Biml. one question I usually get at this point in the session is, well, okay, I can see how this can be interesting, and I can kind of think of a couple of use cases where we can use this, but I already have a large SSIS project. I already have hundreds of packages with different patterns and all of these things, and I don't really want to start from scratch. Is there a way for me to just kind of reverse engineer that? 2 years ago, the answer was nope. No way you can do that. You have to write all of your code, but I'm happy to say that yes, you can actually do that now. This is something that was introduced in Biml Express 2018. So I'll switch back into my Visual Studio here. In Biml Express 2018, which was released in July 2018, you now have the reverse engineering feature. So going back to my Solution Explorer, if I don't want to start from scratch with all of the code that I have, what I can do is take an existing package like this load warehouse colors package, right-click and say convert SSIS packages to Biml. Inside of this, I now get this little interface here that allows me to reverse engineer this package. So I can do a couple of different things. Since I right-clicked on an existing package, it's going to specify that for me here. But I can also go in and choose a DT-Proj from File System, an IS pack, or even a project from the SSIS package catalog. So you have a couple of different options here. For now, I'm just going to use this DTSX from File System. I've specified the path, and I just choose to not include any of these properties. I just want to keep it very simple here. So once I click import, I now see that I have my imported assets down here. I can see that I have one package, since I only reverse engineer one package. If you do a project, this is where you can go in and filter, so if you only want to reverse engineer a couple of packages, for example. You can also choose to specify which connections that you want to import and anything else. So if you have script projects, for example, it's going to show up here in this list as well. So once I have this, I click Add to Project, and you will see that we now have this new file called BimlScript.biml. This now contains all of the reverse engineered code. And you can see that this is pretty much the same thing as I showed you, because we went from Biml to SSIS, and now we reverse engineered back to Biml. But there are a couple of differences here. A few things to notice is that, for example, on the package, it's specified language none. This is something that I didn't have in my original Biml because I only want to use the default. So this is something that you do. Constraint mode has been changed. Again, this is probably fine, but you can change that as well. Include in debug dump, and so on and so on. So there are a couple of differences here in terms of how it converts from SSIS to Biml versus how you might have written that Biml manually. But it does give you an absolutely fantastic starting point for your own projects because, well, this is 44 lines of code that you don't have to write yourself, right? So my recommendation to you is go and download Biml Express 2018 and start by reverse engineering existing packages that you are familiar with. It will help you to see what the Biml code is for your packages and your patterns. And then you can go in and you can learn the rest that you need from this IntelliSense. All right, so I'm going to go in and just delete this file because I don't need it in my project. So that is how you get started. That was the basics of Biml and how you can get started without having to write hundreds of lines of Biml code manually. But there's still kind of something here that we need to get to, and that is what is called the BimlScript. The real power when working with Biml is when you start adding BimlScript to your code files, because you don't want to write hundreds and thousands of lines of Biml code manually. Obviously, that's why we're using Biml, because we don't want to do it manually in SSIS. We don't want to write all of that manually in Biml either. So let's start adding some BimlScript and kind of unlock the real power of Biml. BimlScript are little code blocks of C# or VB. Now, just a quick note that I'm only using C# in my projects because that's the only thing I know. If you are a VB person, I recommend that you check out a guy called Ben Weissman from Germany. He's also a BimlHero, and he is the VB expert. So if you have any questions on that, I'll redirect you to Ben, and he can help you with that. with these BimlScript code blocks, you can do some very powerful things. The first is that you can import all of your source metadata, your entire database structure, and then you can loop over things like your tables and columns. And this will even import things like your indexes and your keys if you need to use that. And then you can replace all of those hard-coded static values with expressions from your metadata. And this BimlScript allows you to generate, control, and manipulate your Biml code. It's kind of similar if you already know things like text for templating. It's very similar to that. Or if you've done things like ASP.NET or PHP with HTML, it kind of works in that same way. And the way this works is with Biml, what we've seen so far is that we have a Biml file, and then we generate some SSIS packages based off of that Biml file. When we add BimlScript to it, we kind of add on a separate layer first. So we have our BimlScript code, which is then being parsed into what I call flat Biml. So we have our BimlScript on the left with our little C# code nuggets. That is being translated to the flat Biml code in the middle, where all we have is pure XML. And then finally, the SSIS packages is based off of that. And there are 3 different code blocks that we're going to look at here in this session today. The first one is called the control block. This is where you specify your variables, your logic, things like if-else statements and for each loops and things like that. Anything that you can do in C#, you can do inside of these control blocks. Then we have something called text blocks. This is what we want to do if we want to replace those hard-coded values with expressions. So the only difference here is that we have that little equal sign on it. That returns a string value, so anything inside this text block needs to be parsed and returned as a string value. So you can get the table name, for example, or the schema name or something like that. And finally, we have something called directives. These are instructions to the compiler. This basically specifies that I want to create my SSIS project in this specific way. And I'll get to an example of that a little later in the session. But just to take a quick look at the basics of BimlScript, and the only thing that you really need to know is what I'm going to show you in this demo today. It's just a couple of lines of code that will get you probably 80% of where you need to go. So the first thing is how you import your metadata. In this case, we have 2 lines of code. In the first line of code, we create a variable called con, and then we say schema manager create connection node. And that little ellipsis, the ... is where we would pass in our connection string. I'm just not showing it in my slide deck here. So this creates a connection to our source database. And then based off of that, on the next line of code, we can say connection.getDatabaseSchema. GetDatabaseSchema, again, it belongs to Schema Manager. It's part of the Biml language. You can copy and paste this code, so you don't even need to remember it. GetDatabaseSchema grabs all of the metadata from your source database, and we store that in a variable called metadata. And now we can go in and loop over our objects in our metadata. So that's what we want to do. Instead of specifying each individual package, we create a for each loop, and we say for each table in metadata.tableNodes, so just give me all the tables, I want to create a package. And again, instead of hard coding that name of the package, we pull out the name of the table from that metadata and we add it into the name. So this is where we add one of those little text code blocks to replace a hard-coded value with this expression. So the name of the package is going to be load underscore the name of the table. So it's very simple. And the way this actually works is this for each loop is being translated into this flat Biml that you can see in the middle. So we have package, 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 and so on, one for each of our source tables, and that generates the SSIS packages. And all of this is now, fortunately, very easy to see and debug in what is called the preview pane in Biml Express. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm switching back to my Visual Studio, and I'm going to open the next part of my demo. What we can see in here is a very simple, very basic BimlScript example. This is just to show you very quickly how this preview pane works. And what we can see is we have one little nugget here, and it's easy to see because they have this nice little yellow highlighting, so it's easy to spot where we have our little BimlScript code nuggets inside our Biml code. And what we have down here is we can click on this Show Preview button, and then we can click on this Update button in the lower right corner to see the expanded Biml. And what this does is that it translates all of these little BimlScript code nuggets, and then it replaces those values so you can see the output inside of this preview pane. So even if you don't have a lot of experience with C# or VB, this really helps you to work on developing your packages, because you can immediately see that, yes, it was actually empty package that I wanted to name this package. So let's jump straight into one of the slightly more advanced examples here. I'm going to skip a few of these demos here today, but just so you know that all of these will be available for you to download. So you can go through them, and I explain things step by step, but I don't want to go through every single one of those steps in the session here today. So we're going to skip to the exciting part where we actually create packages for our entire source database. What we can see in here is that we have 3 variables. We create our destination schema. This is just the schema that I want to insert all of these tables into. And before I move on, I want to switch very quickly over to my SSMS to show you what I want to do in here. So inside my SSMS, I'm just connected to my server here. I want to load all of the tables from the Wide World Importers database, and we can look at the tables. I want to load all the data from these tables into my staging database over here. And the naming standard in Wide World Importers is that it has a schema, for example, application, purchasing, sales, and so on, and then the name of the table. However, in my staging database, what I want to do is I want to use a WWI schema so I can add multiple source databases into my staging. And then I want to change the name into the original schema name underscore table name. So we're kind of renaming our tables in our staging database. And to do that, it's very simple in Biml. We just have to go and pull out the right metadata and then kind of patch it back together the way we want. So going back, the first thing I do is that I specify that I want to load it into the WWI schema. And then, like we saw in the slide deck, I create a connection node. And again, I just pass in my connection string over here. And then I say source connection, get database schema. And inside here, what I've done in here is I've specified import options.exclude views. I only want to grab the table metadata. I don't want to import any view metadata. Tables only, please. There are many different import options. You can exclude keys and indexes and so on. All of that is fairly well documented, so you can go and take a look at that. But for now, all we want to do is import our tables. And then most of this package is similar to the one that I showed you earlier with the truncate and load pattern and so on. So we can see we have our OLEDB connections, we have our variables, our truncate task, and so on. The only differences in here are these little BimlScript code nuggets. So I've wrapped all of this package definition into a for each loop, and I say for each table in source metadata table nodes, create a package. And the name of that package is going to be load underscore, then I'm going to grab the schema name from the table underscore table name, and so on and so on. So everywhere, and I can quickly open up this one file to reference, everywhere that I had these hard-coded values like colors, 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 and so on, all of those have now been replaced with these BimlScript code nuggets, grabbing the schema name or the table name. I also have this very handy little table.getSelectSQL, and this is something that might not be very intuitive. So this is where we might want to go into our preview pane and look at what this actually, how it compiles. So now it goes in and pulls out all of that metadata, and then it's going to show us here in just a couple of seconds. So let me scroll back down. we want to look at this direct input table.getSelectSQL. So if we scroll down in our flat Biml now, we can see that all of those code nuggets have been replaced with the actual table values. And then down here in the source, you can see that by using table.getSelectSQL, it generates this select SQL for us. So we don't even have to worry about, specifying the columns or anything like that. All of that is automated for us by Biml. And down in our code, same pattern that we had before. And we can see now when we scroll down that we have all the way down to our log rows. Then we close out the package, and then it creates the next package for us. So by writing 75 lines of BimlScript code in our actual file, and that includes a lot of white space here, we now generate, 2,250 lines of flat Biml code. And hopefully this shows you that you don't want to write 2,000 lines of Biml code manually. That's why you want to use BimlScript in your code. So once we have all of this code and we've gone through our preview pane to check that, yes, everything looks okay, we can go ahead and click Generate SSIS Packages. And this is where my Visual Studio usually starts hanging, so I grab something to drink. It takes a few seconds to go in, grab all of that metadata, pull it in, and then generate all of those SSIS packages for us. And when you're doing a demo like this, it might feel like it's taking forever to sit down here and wait for the spin, but imagine having to do all of this manually. So one thing that we do get here is it asks us, in addition to 47 new items, the template generated the following items that conflict. Would you like to overwrite? And this is the one package that we created earlier because I didn't delete it from my project. So do you want to overwrite it? And just make sure that you don't overwrite anything that has been manually created. Make sure you only overwrite the packages that you can actually regenerate. So in this case, yes, I do want to overwrite. I click Commit. And there we go. Voila. We now have, I don't even know how many packages this is, but a whole lot of packages in our project, one for each of our source tables. So if we open up this load warehouse colors again, we can see that it's truncating, loading, and logging. And same thing for sales. Truncate sales, load sales, and log rows. So 75 lines of BimlScript code generates, 70-something packages in here. That is pretty time-saving and pretty powerful, at least to me. So I'm going to close all of these out. And hopefully at this point, I've kind of inspired you to see that this way of developing SSIS for these kind of use cases, especially for data warehousing, can be extremely time-saving. Again, one Biml code, 75 lines of code, spinning up 42 different packages. And then if you want to change something, you change one line of code and regenerate the packages. That in itself can get you probably 80% of the way. The other thing, though, that we usually do in our projects is, what about the SQL? So what I've done so far is I've only looked at how to generate the SSIS packages, and I already had my entire staging environment set up. So we can generate our SSIS packages, but can we include our SQL in there as well? And of course we can. Biml is super powerful. So there are a couple of different things that we need to know when we're working with SQL code. So two ways of structuring your code that is slightly different from what I've shown you so far. And that is by using tiered Biml files. This is basically just multiple Biml files working together as one big Biml project. So tiered Biml files, you can think of it in two different ways. The first one is kind of like stacked layers, where you start with the tier 0 at the bottom, and then you have tier 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you can give these any numbers. You can do 10, 20, 30, 100, 200, 300, and so on. That's entirely up to you, but for slide deck purposes, I'm just sticking with 0, 1, and 2. And I'm starting with 0 because that is the default lowest tier in Biml. So you can either think of tiered Biml files as layers, where you start with the lowest one and then you build on top of that, or as sequential steps. And this might make a little more sense when you think of it in terms of SSIS because of the way you work with it. And the way you work with tier BIML files is to do things like solve logical dependencies and build solutions in multiple steps. For example, you start by creating your connections to your databases. You need to do that before you can create any tasks connecting to those connections. And then in terms of very standard pattern is to have like a parent package, a master package, or something, a control package. You do need to create those loading packages before you can create those master packages. So that is a different way of thinking of it. All of those are steps that you need to take when you're working in SSIS, and you can kind of simulate that by splitting your BIML code in multiple files. And hopefully that will make a little more sense once you actually see the code in a few minutes. And the way you do that is by specifying the template directive. Again, this is a BimlScript code nugget that starts with the little @ sign, and you simply say template, tier, and then you give it a number. I actually recommend that you use numbers like 10, 20, 30, or 100, 200, 300 instead of 1, 2, and 3. The reason for that is that at some point you might want to inject another layer. You realize that you need to do something else, and instead of going in and renumbering all your tiers, you can just add 15 or 25 or something like that in there. But you have full control. You start with a 0 and then you move on up after that. When you're using tiered BIML files, you need to specify a way to grab some kind of information, some kind of metadata from a lower tier BIML file in the next tier BIML file. And to do that, you specify something called annotations. Now, annotations are not like SSIS annotations. SSIS annotations are just comments inside your package. BIML annotations are where you can actually store custom metadata by attaching little tags to your BIML objects. And the way you do that is very simply you say annotation tag, you give that tag a name, and then you pass in the value. So this is kind of simple. You can only store string values in here, but for most of what you need to do, this is enough. And by doing this, in those higher tier BIML files, it can go in and get those tags from lower tier BIML files. And the way you do that, again, in this example here that you can see, we create an OLEDB connection, and then we add an annotation to it. So we're adding that destination schema, which is STG in this case. We're adding that as a tag. And then later in our BIML script, we can say root node. That goes into the root of our project so we can get any object that we have in there. Then we go in and we want to find an OLEDB connection. We find the one called dest, and then we get the tag called schema from that. And that final little line of code there is going to return the string value of STG. And by doing this, it's hopefully all going to make sense in just a minute here when I show you the code. By combining things like this, we can build solutions in multiple steps. We can get things from lower tier BIML files and use that in higher tier BIML files and create our entire project in one build, but it's multiple steps behind the scenes. So let's try and put it all together and see if we can make sense of this. Going back to our project, I'm going to minimize this and open up my staging project. Now, what you can see in here is, let me go in and zoom in for you here. What you can see is that we have 4 files. I have a tier 0 file where I specify my environment. So this is where I specify my connections and so on. Then I have 3 other tier BIML files. Our tier 10 BIML file is where I create the SQL script that I can use to create my destination tables. Then I create my SSIS packages in the tier 20 file. And finally, a master package that calls all of those loading packages in my tier 30 file. So let's open up these and see how that actually works. I'm going to start with the environment file. That's the lowest tier BIML file. What I'm doing in here, I specify the tier, so it's 0. And then I define all the metadata, and I only want to do this once. So I create all of this metadata and I store it in my variables. So I store my admin connection string, my source connection string, my destination connection string, my destination database name, and my destination schema name. So if I want to go in later and say that I want to change from wide world importers back to the boring adventure works, for example, I just change it in these few lines of code. Further down on this file, I specify my connections. So this is very similar. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here so we can see a little bit more. In my connections, so instead of passing in the actual connection string, I'm now referring to this admin connection string, source connection string, and so on. And on the destination, I'm adding two tags. I'm adding the destination database tag and the destination schema tag. So I know that I want to store my data in the staging database in the WWI schema. Further down, you can see that I'm using these tags in multiple places. So that's why I define them on the top of the files. I specify my database and my schema. And then down into the important part here, where we specify our actual tables. What I'm doing in here is I'm specifying my destination table. So this is where I can define all of those staging tables that I want to create. So it's similar to what I did previously, that I create a connection node, I create a connection to our source, and then I say get database schema. Then I loop over all of those tables, but instead of creating one package for each table, I define a table. So the name of this table is going to be the original schema name underscore original name, and then the schema name is going to be destination database name dot destination schema, so staging dot WWI. Then I go in and I grab all the columns that we had on the original table. I say for each column in table.columns, column.getBiml. And what this does, I'm going to go back into our preview pane so we can see what this looks like. So this little snippet here is going to spit out the Biml code for all of our source table columns. Just give it a few more seconds to think here. There we go. So if I scroll down here to this first table, we'll see that I now have city ID, city name, state province ID, location, and so on and so on. It specifies the data types and lengths and so on for us. In addition to those original table columns, I need to add my specific column that I only have in my staging environment called the load date. So I create a column of type date time, and I add on a tag and I say that this is an ETL column. It's not a source column, it's only used for ETL purposes. So I'm adding on a little tag there, and you'll see in just a minute where we go in and use that. Finally, on the source itself, on the table itself, we add another tag called source schema qualified name, and we grab the schema qualified name. If we scroll down, we can now see that that is application.cities. And the reason we need to store this is because we do need in our packages to go in and grab our data from some table, so we do need to know which table we're grabbing it from. And the reason we do that is obviously because we rename our destination table. So with just a few lines of code here, we've now specified our entire table. The next step is to go in to our next tier Biml file and go in and generate that SQL code. What I'm doing in here, this might look a little weird, but there was a reason for this. I wrap all of the SQL code inside an annotation, and it's just of type code comment. This allows me to just store the SQL inside my project. It doesn't do anything. If I didn't have this annotation here and I would try to generate this package, it would crash and tell me that, hey, set database, destination database is not a valid Biml tag. So by wrapping it inside an annotation, I'm just storing it as some metadata. And what I can do then is go in the preview pane and copy and paste and use that code. So before I do that, I'm just going to quickly walk you through what we're doing. So we're specifying our destination database. I need to have a use statement in my SQL. So I say root node.onlydb connections, get the destination connection, and then get the tag called database. and then just input this in my code. Then I go and I create the destination schema. So all of this is just standard SQL code, except that I'm going into the destination and I'm getting the tag called schema. And then finally, we want to create our tables. And I don't know about you, but this is probably the easiest way of writing SQL code that you can think of. I say for each table in root node.tables, and this is where I point to those tables that were created in my previous Biml file. I say table, get, drop, and create DDL. So looking at this preview, this file, which, by the way, is a higher tier, is going to go in and parse and compile everything that we did in our environment and build up that table definition. Then it's going to go in and for each of those tables that we created in that previous file, spit out the get, drop, and create DDL. So if I scroll down here, you can now see that I have drop, create table, our column definitions, and so on. So it's actually generating quite a few lines of SQL code here. And what I do now is I personally go in and manually copy this code, move over to my SSMS, and create this code, create this in a new query in the SSMS. I could just as easily have created an SSIS package with all of this code wrapped in an execute SQL statement. So I could generate that package and then execute that package to create my destination. The reason I'm not doing that is because it's so easy to accidentally forget that you have that one there, and you definitely don't want to deploy any drop and create into your production environment. And most likely you also have a DBA who probably wants to go in and actually do this part here for you. So what you can do is you can create this in your development environment, you can check it into source control, any way that you would do it in a traditional project where you would create some SQL scripts and then pass it over to your DBA. So I've just copied and pasted all of this code from my Biml file. I execute it and commands completed successfully. I now have my entire staging environment. So I can even go in and look at the tables. We can see that the row counts are 0 in our staging environment because we just dropped and created everything. So going back, we have now created our entire environment. So that is the first step. We specified our environment and we created the SQL. Then we went in and manually created those tables. The next step is creating the SSIS packages, and this is exactly the same as I showed you earlier, except for one thing. We're now saying again for each table in root node.tables because those are the ones that we specified in a previous file in our environment file. Same thing, we go in, we use all the table metadata, and then down here we say get tag source schema qualified name for the source. So again, if we look at the preview, we're going to let that think for just a moment. Here we go. We can now see that our, where did it go? External table input here is, yep, there we go, external table input. So application.cities. So we can grab all of that and then load it into our destination, which is WWI application_cities. Then finally, when we have all of these loading packages, we want to create that master package. Very simple. We create one package called master and then just the schema name here. And then inside of that, we grab all the packages that we created previously. So instead of looping over our root node.tables, we're now looping over our root node.packages. That's referring to the packages that we created in the previous tier Biml file. So again, looking at the preview, it's going to give us a nice little list here of all the packages that we want to create in that project. Here we go. So we have application cities, countries, and so on and so on. Now by doing this, just to wrap it all up, when we have tiered Biml files, we can specify our environment in one file, do our SQL code in the next step, and then create all of our loading packages plus the master packages in one step when we generate the packages. So we split it up into multiple files, which are kind of our steps, but when we want to create our Biml packages, we just select all of the files at once and generate SSIS packages. Now it's going to go in, think for a few seconds, and give me a chance to grab a drink. Any minute now. There we go. And inside of our project, we now have all of our loading packages, including the master package. And if we open up that master package, you can now see that it's executing all of those packages. So instead of creating packages one by one, and then finally creating that master package and creating one by one task in here, we automated everything by just splitting it into multiple files. And hopefully that makes sense to all of you watching this. Again, if anything is unclear, I'll be taking questions very shortly, and you can always reach out to me afterwards once you've played around with the demo files. But all of this is available for you to download from my website. So going back, we put it all together. So now we've looked at the how to create our tiered Biml files, to create our SQL and our SSIS. In this case, if we're going back to Sandra, what she would usually do if she were told that you need to go and create a brand new project with 300 new SSIS packages, instead of going like, oh, yes, I need to create 300 packages by hand. Now that Sandra knows Biml, she can go, of course I can create 200 SSIS packages. What do you need me to do after lunch? And that is at least my goal for you guys. So over the last 60 minutes or so, we've looked at the basics of Biml and BimlScript, the syntax, and how it works with and compared to SSIS. We looked at different tools. We can use Biml Express 2018, and then if we have that, we get the reverse engineering feature, which is extremely powerful as well. And finally, we tied it all together and showed you how you can create all your SQL code and all your SSIS packages from metadata in just a few minutes. Obviously, it took me a little more than a few minutes to create these demos for you, but you can go in and download them, and you won't have to start from scratch. So I want to end the session with some advice based on personal experience. I know this is quite a lot to take in just 1 hour, but start small. Start small and start simple and start with ugly code. Like, as long as it works, just get things done. And keep going. Don't get obsessed with trying to create a fully metadata-driven framework from day one, because you're never ever going to create the perfect framework, but keep going. The goal here is to move from SSIS to Biml, because Biml can save you time, but only as long as you use that tool correctly. So use Biml in those cases where you can see that you can actually save time by automating some of those repetitive tasks, and then leave that kind of more those unique things for manual SSIS development. But keep going, expand and improve, and deliver often. Make sure you deliver as often as you can. My goal for you guys is that you can finish up your entire week's worth of work on Monday and then take a Biml break the rest of the week. Just as long as you don't tell your boss, just say that it's going to take me about a week to finish this SSIS project. Do it all with Biml on Monday and take the rest of the week off. That's at least my goal for all of you guys. That is all that I had, and again, I know this is quite a lot to take in just 1 hour. It's a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I know I can talk a little fast when I get excited. So go to my website. You can download all of the demo files. This recording is going to be posted very shortly if you want to go back and see something again. And if you have any questions, email me or tweet me, and I'll be happy to help you out. So I am going to check in with Mark and see if he is still awake and see if we have any questions here today.
Hey there, Catherine. Yeah, I'm very attentive. I've enjoyed the whole presentation, so thank you very much for that. Yeah, we've got some questions. I also want to just reiterate about your website. I've been having a look on there whilst you've been speaking as well. I have noticed there's lots and lots of Biml content there, so please everyone go to Catherine's website. You'll find it very useful. Right, so without further ado, let's go to the questions. The first one I have is that I currently work in a very restrictive environment, so getting new software deployed is very, very hard. I know we need Biml. Problem is what are the prerequisites? Is it just a simple install with .NET required, or is there more that I need to request?
So you will need the Biml Express add-in. So you probably have Visual Studio SQL Server Data Tools installed already because you need to work on your SSIS project.
That's right.
So you need to add that Visual Studio add-in called Biml Express. You can install that as an admin. I do believe that there's also an option to install it just for your own user, which doesn't require as elevated permissions. I think you can do that. If that's not possible, I will have to pass you over to Verigen support and let them handle that.
Cool.
But it's just one single add-in that you need to work with Biml.
Okay, so I just need to be persuasive then, don't I? Yes. Right, okay. I was very pleased to hear that the Express edition now has the ability to reverse engineer packages, which I saw as being one of the main reasons to go to Biml Studio. So I'm guessing my question is there any reason, or what are the reasons to go to Biml Studio over Express?
Yes, so Biml Studio is the licensed tool. Biml Express is free, Biml Studio is paid. It's quite expensive, and the main reason you want to go to Biml Studio is because that allows you to automate the actual generation of SSIS packages again. So inside of Visual Studio, you have to go in and right-click and say Generate SSIS Packages. So you still have that step manual with the free tool. You can automate that through the command line if you invest in a Biml Studio license, so you can set up everything to be built completely automated, so you don't even have to go in and generate those packages. But if you want to stick to the free version, you do have to go in and say right-click, generate SSIS packages. So that's the main reason you want to invest in Biml Studio if you have something that is fully automated from start to end. And then of course, Biml Studio has a lot more features. So it can work with SSIS cubes, Azure Data Factory. It can auto-generate all of the documentation for your project for you, and many other things. So it does have a lot more features, but for the basic SSIS development, Biml Express is probably good for most people.
Yeah. So that actually leads on, or I think you may have covered this question. Gangadir asked, can I generate SSIS packages from the command line? So I'm guessing you're saying the only way you can do that is through Studio.
Yes, that requires a license.
I noticed you did quite a good blog post on Biml Express. Let me just go up to it. Lost it now. Biml Express 2018, the new features.
Yep.
I can't find it now on my screen, but you mentioned in there, and this was one of my questions as well, about the ability to use Biml for Azure Data Factory, and I'm just wondering what the experience is like using the Biml Studio tool for Data Factory. Is it a very similar experience to what you've just demonstrated?
Yes, it's very similar. So I'm going to try and keep this very short here. Biml is amazing for SSIS because you don't really have any other alternatives for generating SSIS packages through code that are as easy as Biml. With Azure Data Factory version 2, you can use things like Python and PowerShell and things like that. Biml is an alternative. So it works very much in the same way. You write your Biml and then you can generate the JSON files for ADF and then use those. You do need to be aware that is Biml the right tool? It can definitely be the right tool if you have a large project where you have things like both SSIS and ADF, or still use Biml for SSIS and deploy that up through ADF. If you only want to generate the ADF, the pipelines themselves, Biml might not be as time-saving as it is for SSIS. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but instead of generating the SSIS packages, you generate the JSON files for ADF.
Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. That does answer my question. So Christopher Dougherty first says good day, and then goes on to ask about whether the SIS, this Biml Express component will integrate with SIS component tasks from third-party vendors. He's
Yes,
given
it
some
will.
examples. So yes, SharePoint data source from Kingsway Soft is a specific example.
I'm not familiar with that specific one, but Biml, you can use any kind of third-party components in Biml as well. It does require a fair amount of coding, and that is one of my more recent blog posts. I show how to use the OData source and connection manager through Biml. That can hopefully give you a little guidance on the custom component code that you need to write in Biml. But again, it is supported, and I recommend that you go in and create an example package in SSIS, reverse engineer it, and then you get all the code from there.
Right, excellent. Okay,
But anything you can do in SSIS, including third-party components, is supported in Biml. The only thing is you probably do need to write maybe 50 extra lines of code for those custom things.
Okay, cool. Okay, so one thing that was niggling me slightly was that when you reverse engineer packages, is there anything in the control or data flow that may be missed with the scripting?
I do know that there have been a few bugs, so you do need to make sure that it actually generates all the Biml code as expected. Go through that manually.
Yeah.
It should reverse engineer everything. If it doesn't, then it's probably a bug and it needs to be fixed. But again, you also do need to kind of go through that manually and check.
Okay, cool. So we have Mr. Paul Hunter. Hello, Paul. Has asked the question, are there any plans to have Biml for SSRS so the report RDL can be generated similar to SIS packages?
Short answer is no.
Okay.
The reason for that is, I think this has been asked quite a few times over the years, is that there's not really that much need to automate report generation the same way as SSIS packages, because reports are very visual. You do kind of want to move things around on an interface as compared to SSIS. So while you probably have a use case that would be perfect with Biml, no, it's not going to be implemented. That's not something they want to spend their time on.
Cool. Okay. Well, unless someone else comes up with another question, this one will be the last. When you were given the example of the a Biml script that looped over tables from the metadata schema view. I was just wondering whether it was possible to use some kind of filtering on that collection. I'm guessing because it's C#, we can quite easily just do a property comparison or something.
Yes. So in that get database schema tag, I would recommend that you go to my website and search for that. And I honestly don't mean to be self-promoting as much as I'm actually doing here, but I have a blog post on get database schema that shows you how you can filter. You can filter on the source schemas, the source tables, and then you have all of those import options. So if you only want to pull out one schema or 3 specific tables, you can easily do that by passing in just a couple of lists to that get database schema function.
Excellent. And you've got to tell me, in 5 years' time from now, when I'm a Biml expert, how would I become a Biml hero?
So to become a Biml hero, it's quite a lot of work, to be honest. You do need to take a long test that's like 100 questions. You have to sit through a full day of advanced training with Mr. Scott Curry, who is the creator of Biml. And if you think I talk fast, you should listen to Scott. He's like 3 times my speed, and he's going deep dive from minute 5. But it's very fun. The main thing with the BimlHero certification is that you do need to have real-life experience, because you do need to hand in a code sample of a production-ready Biml solution, including a short 2-page white paper on how you implemented the solution in a project. When you do that, you hand that in, and then Scott and the team in Verigens goes through all of that code, sits down with you for about an hour to walk you through things that you can improve and so on. If they think it's good enough, you get the stamp of approval and you become a Biml hero. If you need to change something, you have an additional 30 days to fix that before you go through that same process again.
Excellent.
It is also fairly expensive. They spend a lot of time and resources on actually training and going through all of these things. So it's fairly expensive, and they do require that you have some experience already before they let you into that program.
Okay.
So there are currently, I think, 10 BimlHeroes in the world.
Cool. Okay, well, as I say, it's going to take me a good 5 years to apply. You know, you never know. Right, well, I think that wraps it up for tonight. I really enjoyed that presentation. I'm going to be showing it to my work colleagues as well, so hopefully we can get Biml in as soon as possible. Where are you speaking next, Cathrine?
I'm speaking next in Oslo on September 1st, and then I'll be in Glasgow for SQL GLA in mid-September.
Awesome. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Hopefully I can convince you to come back again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to present for you today.